The McAlvany Weekly Commentary, covering monetary, economic, and geopolitical news events. Now, here are Kevin Orrick and David McAlvany.
Welcome to the McAlvany Weekly Commentary. I'm Kevin Orrick along with David McAlvany, and our guest today, Senator Kent Lambert. David, it's interesting. We have talked about the financial moving to the economic, to the political, to the strategic, the geostrategic. And, we have some interesting people who listen to the commentary. We have some interesting people who we have communication with, but rarely ever do we get to talk to somebody who's an expert from the financial to the economic to the political and the geostrategic. And we have that in Senator Kent Lambert.
Well, here locally, Budget Committee, appropriations, and of course his experience with those things goes back to when he was working in the Air Force, spent time in the Pentagon, and a very interesting guy because, frankly, starting with a degree at the Air Force Academy in military history, then moving on to international relations, master's there at the University of Southern California, strategic and tactical sciences, another master's degree from the Air Force Institute of Technology. That led into a career that was primarily spent flying planes, big B-52s,
right?
At teaching either training others how to fly those planes, and then a number of stints both in Europe and the Middle East. Again, working for the Pentagon in air defense as an attaché in Jordan and in Sweden, working with the Deputy Defense Intelligence Office there in Europe. And again, it just goes on and on. Quite broad experience, and frankly, I'm glad he's on our side, and he's also in the state legislature representing the people of Colorado.
Well, and something that's always interested me about Senator Lambert is, he was, during the modeling and simulations at the Pentagon, he was working for the Reagan administration and later Clinton's nuclear posturing, the ICBMs. And, there were policies that were changed because of Kent Lambert's modeling and the simulations. We had ICBMs still, partially because of the team that he was on in the Pentagon. Well, something I also like, Dave, is when he brings his expertise to the political realm. Okay, we talked about his stint in Amman, Jordan, and his understanding of the Muslim Brotherhood. That's the strategic. But now he comes back and he realizes the value of state government and to have a sound government, whether it's a national government, which all national governments have gold reserves. He's actually been a proponent of putting states on gold reserves as well.
If it's good for a foreign central bank, why wouldn't it be good for an independent state where you have to look at your finances, the resources that you have, the reserves that you have, and making sure that they're allocated in a healthy way. And in this instance, actually a constitutionally mandated way. Very intriguing.
Well, David, we're here on the road with a conference here in Denver, and fortunately we've been able to bring Senator Lambert in.
Each week we look at market issues, we look at international issues, we look at a whole host of things, and it's important to consider domestic politics as well as international politics. And it's not every day that we get to sit down and visit with someone who has experience in both arenas. Master's degree in international relations from University of Southern California, a long history, as we've just discussed, in the military, in public service, and now, in the Colorado State Legislature. Kent Lambert has a perspective, given his background, given his CV, that is both international in nature, but also very practical and pragmatic when it comes to domestic policies, both on a national and a state level. So a lot of ground to cover because, Kent, what we want to do is maybe start with some of the things that you've put in play here in the state of Colorado, which are unique, and then we'll branch off from that to the national level, and then after that kind of look at some of your notes, things that you are observing today in the European spheres as well as the Middle East and Egypt in particular, because you've got some very practical experience there. You introduced a piece of legislation here in Colorado that related to gold, a unique piece of legislation, but there seems to be a growing trend of legislators who are thinking about the role of gold in the economy, the role that it played, the standard bearer, if you will, in the monetary system. What was that about? And have you worked cooperatively with other state legislators? Tell us a little bit about that and what you're trying to accomplish and what you hope to see.
Sure. Well, thank you, David. We have a practicality here in Colorado. I'm a Republican in a Democratic majority, so realistically, we always have to look at the numbers and know some of this legislation is not going to pass. But I think it's more than symbolic. I think we can set a precedent of at least public education, or even education of our legislators. And frankly, I had some positive feedback from some of our Democrat legislators about the problems that we're facing. It's always a question, what's the right level to approach some of these problems? Are we going to allow the federal government to make all of our monetary decisions? Or under a federalistic system, can the states actually step up and either challenge the federal government over constitutionality of some of these principles, or start some new programs? Well, I think in bringing that forward, the discussion was the most important part of it. I was able to, for instance, bring forward the facts that over the last 10 years, we've been on a basically exponential decay rate of the U.S. dollar. What are we doing about this? What happens if we do have a super hyperinflationary problem in the future because of those international or national policies that are put into effect? And as a state, what's our responsibility to survive or to endure through that period? And looking at some of those alternatives. So, I think one of the precedents that I wanted to set was the fact that in some of our state investments, in some of our reserves, that we should be thinking about physical assets as well, in particular gold or silver bullion or something like other central banks do. Why? There's nothing illegal about a state actually putting some of our reserves in a tangible asset. I think if we had done that at the time of my legislation, we actually would have made a profit. Even with the gold market coming down in the last couple of months, it still would have been at least a break even, if not a increase in value for the state holdings. And it was a trivial amount for a state government. We're going to start with $1 million to show that it could be done, but even that was robustly defeated by the Democrat majority, because they don't want to challenge the fiat currency system of the U.S. government.
Now, Colorado's not the only state that has done this. There's half a dozen, hopefully there's dozens in future years that consider similar pieces of legislation, and ultimately we hope that there's traction gained between all of those states. Again, as you say, not just the symbolism of the gold standard as it was, but who is responsible for our money, and who is responsible for the healthy operation of the economy. You start with the household as the primary unit in the economy, and from there extend to a community, a state, and then ultimately arrive at the nation. But it seems that most of the decisions are being taken in a very top-down manner, and to ask the question of who's responsible, I think is a pretty good one.
And of course, a lot of these questions have been addressed and answered during our original Constitutional Convention. Roger Sherman obviously had a solution in drafting Article 1, Section 10 that said the states will use gold and silver in payment of debts. He had something very, very specific in mind. What happened? Since 1913. Have we completely lost the entire concept of the U.S. Constitution on monetary value? Apparently we have. But it's still on the books. The principle is still out there. If we had followed some standardization of our currency over the last 100 years now, maybe we wouldn't be in the tremendous debt problems we have right now. Maybe we wouldn't be manipulating currency as we are now. So I think some of these things need to, have public education. We need to get it to the table. We need to have, as you say, interstate dialogue and conversation with some of our other legislators in other states and at the federal government, and see what kind of solution our existing government structure can come up with.
Moving sort of to the national level, do you have any thoughts on trends, new, different, disturbing, encouraging, dive in where you will, trends sort of in national politics?
I do, and maybe not even with the federal system, but just as a nation, I think there's some trends happening, and I think you've mentioned some of them on your podcast in the past. One structure I find very useful to think through some of the dynamics of our economy is what you often mention, going from, and I think you start the show with it every week, going from the monetary to the fiscal policy to the political realm, and then over to the geostrategic effects of that. But I've felt that there are two maybe new nodes that we ought to bring to the discussion. And I kind of came to this conclusion partially from reading about some of the social issues that we're having, as well as some of the demographic issues. I play around, I'm certainly no Greek scholar, but I came across two Greek words that I thought were very important. One is oikos, which is actually a Greek yogurt. I mean, it's now a company, the Oikos company is a style of yogurt. But what that means in Greek is household. It's probably the closest word to family. And the family institution of the United States, I think, is under very, very direct attack, both socially and fiscally. Several times I think mentioned on the show that the bill payers for programs like Obamacare or growth of big government is coming out of the family wallet. And we measure some of these terms. President Obama mentioned several times, Obamacare is going to save $2,500 per family per year across the United States. It's not happening. If anything, it's going to go the other direction, that healthcare costs are going to go up. But the real question is, who is making the decisions? The institution of the family has typically, I think, been the decision-making unit. When we talk about home economics, that's really a redundant term because economics, the basis of that word comes from that Greek word oikos. It means the household. So when you say home, household, that's pretty redundant. That is the basic element of our economic system. Those household decisions that are made on a day-to-day basis. What car do I buy? Well, now I guess the federal government's bought, some of the car companies, they can make that decision. And when they put in the CAFE standards, when you mentioned that 95% of the home loans are underwritten by the U.S. government rather than the private market, that means you have a central government taking over a lot of those lower level decisions that ought to be made by families. Healthcare. I mean, just think of the big bills that a family has to pay. Now we're saying, well, you're not going to pay that anymore. You're not going to be able to decide what your health care is. We're going to have a one-size-fits-all central government plan, like every socialist government's done in the past. We're going to control all that for you and give you what you need. Well, that takes away that decision responsibility from the family. Also, I think when we look at that, I mean, I'm a conservative, and sometimes we come across politicians all across the country that say, well, I'm a fiscal conservative. I believe in fiscal principles, but I don't believe in all that social conservatism. Well, if they don't believe that the family should have a more predominant role in making those decisions, then what's the fiscal aspect of a bad social policy? I mean, we've made some very serious flaws in the direction of those trends we've had nationally or in the state governments and so forth by trying to separate out a family from a fiscal policy or social policy from a fiscal policy, because it always has fiscal impact. I guess that leads into the second term, which is
that second node you were talking about.
The second node that we may need to look at, and that's the Greek word demos, which basically means the power of the city. And you get words like demography or demographics or democracy. How do people socially relate to one another? And what does the population itself look like? Well, 40 years ago, we made some decisions, for instance, getting back to the social versus fiscal conservatives, we made some decisions about abortion in this country. And we've had about 55 million abortions of people who would be adults today. And look at the demographics. I mean, the two realities we have is we have a lot of baby boomers who came out of the late 40s, early 50s, who are now of the age when they're retiring, they are no longer the fiscal engine driving our economy, and now are becoming sort of into receiving benefits from the rest of the population, but we have 55 million less population to support them.
Right. So, going back to that issue of separating out sort of social issues from fiscal issues, if you wanted to set aside the social, which is difficult to do, as you say, but look at the issue we have today. 81% of our mandatory programs, Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, a few others, that is 81% of our tax revenues are going to these programs, and they're driven demographically. We have a ballooning of the population that is interested or recipients of these programs, and on the other side, the mismatch is you don't have enough workers to accommodate the balloon in payments going out.
Right, and even the basic assumptions of economics, I think classical economics, Adam Smith, as I recall, one of the factors of a strong economy, according to Adam Smith, was a growing population. You'd have more workers, you had more resources to fuel that engine of economic enterprise. Well, what's been happening to our population, to our demography, is that we have sort of a binodal thing where you have a whole lot of people who are retirement age, who are now spending their income that they've saved up, or the Social Security that they expect, which never was saved. It's actually transfer payments from the next generation, but the next generation is how can they make any money? Some people call that the boomerang generation. I kind of interesting that term. When the kids are growing up, the parents throw them out of the house and they whip around the yard a little bit, and they always come back to live in their parents' house because they can't make it anymore. And now we're going to put an individual mandate on them to pay maybe $2,500, $3,000 a year in additional insurance that they can't afford right now. And all of a sudden, I think they're waking up and saying, we can't afford this. Better that I just quit my job, go on public assistance, and, increase the caseload for food stamps, for Medicaid, and all the other benefits. And this is what we're seeing at the state level. So supposedly our economy is in recovery, and yet the number of people on the SNAP program or food stamps continues to grow. It's not reversing. Why is that? I mean, if our economy is getting better, shouldn't we have fewer people in poverty on public assistance?
This is like the opacity in China, where the economy is growing and yet energy usage is down and electricity usage is down, and your basic indicators of real growth are actually in decay and in decline. Meanwhile, the official statistics are advertising, again, all is fine, move along, don't ask any questions.
Yeah, nothing to see here. Well, and we're seeing it now. I just saw a report this morning that 47% of Americans now have a full-time job. That's less than half of Americans have a full-time job. That's unprecedented. What's happening is people, probably because of an influence of Obamacare, that's probably at least the expectations of that.
It's part of it.
People are getting part-time jobs. We have a lot of what they call the 29ers out there who only get 29 hours of work per week, because if you get any more than that, you're going to go over that 30-hour threshold, and now you're getting into an unaffordable situation for their small business.
Yeah, factored into the most recent employment numbers, you had 132,000 statistical creations. This is the birth-death models, not actual jobs created, but 132,000 jobs penciled in, if you will, on the basis of that modeling, and then 322,000 jobs that came in on the part-time side. that helped us get to, on a net basis, an addition of 190 and change, 195.
And what a terrible expectation. You know, Dad, I got through high school. Dad, I got through college. And all I can get is a part-time job somewhere in a franchise place or, you know, franchise hamburgers or something like that, because those companies simply won't hire me. It's not worth it to them to hire me for a full-time job. That's shocking in America. And it's all apparently, or maybe it's not all due to government regulations, but that seems to be a major factor going on here.
This is a big jump, but you know, when we look at conflict, and you know, we think of war, we think of many different kinds of conflict, but it involves space. You bring a unique perspective to this because not only have you had involvement with the government dealing with outer space programs, but you've also had sort of the boots on the ground experience in the Middle East, in Europe, and here in the United States. So you have exposure to airspace, outer space, you know, and then all of your territories of traditional conflict in both Europe and in the Middle East. So what I'd like to ask is sort of your perspective on Europe. NATO played a significant role. You spent time, again, boots on the ground in Europe, perhaps when NATO had more of a role. What are the transitions there, and what do you see in terms of European development or devolvement?
Well, on a major anniversary of Roswell, I'm glad you didn't talk about the extraterrestrial experience, but yeah, I mean, the world is changing, and I had a background in strategic air command at a time when that was when that threat was going away. It appeared as though the Soviet Union was, you know, under great pressure, and our vital national interests were going to shift to some area of the world, specifically the Middle East. And I had a really interesting job interview on the 2nd of August of 1990 when I went in and I told the generals at the Pentagon. They said, well, why would you want to go to the Middle East? And I told them exactly that. I said, you know, this is going to be the number one area of our national interest for several years. And I went home, turned on
decades.
Decades.
Yeah.
And I went home, back to the hotel, and I turned on the television, and unbeknownst to me, Saddam Hussein was in the actual act of invading Kuwait on that day. Mm-hmm. So I figured, well, I must have bluffed them enough, so they thought I knew what I was talking about. So I got hired to be the air attaché to Amman, Jordan, and then later got to be in the American Embassy in Stockholm, Sweden. Yes, I mean, the sort of the end of the Cold War paradigm of the Warsaw Pact versus NATO is certainly now a thing of the past. Very exciting times. I was also air attaché to Latvia, and you know, the Baltic Sea states especially, and Poland, and Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, coming out of decades of dictatorial communist regimes, suddenly had some self-determination. And in conference after conference that I went to, where there was a discussion about joining the European Union and having some sort of co-prosperity sphere and so forth, we had national leaders stand up and say, you know, we don't really care about that. The only thing we care about is joining NATO. We want to be in the political process in NATO because we think that that's more important to our national security than just simply some sort of economic currency regime or something. You're using the euro, and you know, what good's that going to get us? So interesting, though, as we're transitioning into this, Europe itself, and not just Western Europe, but now Eastern Europe, wants to have unification for their own defensive purposes. So they have a place at the table for their own national security. Very interested in that. So I thought that was a thrilling type of thing. And of course now the whole idea of European integration is almost more along a north-south line within Europe rather than an east-west line. Where is the risk? Isn't it in your pigs countries? Isn't it in Italy and Spain and Portugal, where or Greece, they simply don't have the earning power that some of the other Eastern European countries or Germany has. So I see that there's more, again, almost a concert of Europe type of redraft of the map. How are we going to keep Europe peaceful and unified? What kind of structures are going to be leading into, perhaps the next 100 years in Europe without collapsing the whole economy based upon different sources of national debt?
And does NATO have a role in that?
Well, NATO is really a political entity, not a military entity, but it does deal with national security purposes. Whether I don't know if that organization is probably not the right one to intervene in the European Union debacles that they've been having, but you also see some countries are saying, look, we still need our national sovereignty. We still need maybe our national currency back just to protect the well-being of our citizens. Mm-hmm. So, of course, looking at the violent history of Europe in the 20th century, that's got to be a foremost concern in Europe, is the internal frictions between Turkey and Greece, or between France and Germany. I mean, who knows what, 5-10 years from now, where those dividing lines are going to be, or between the north and the south of Europe.
You also saw some pretty significant changes in the Middle East when you were in Jordan, the shift towards parliamentary elections, actually the presence of the Muslim Brotherhood in Jordan at the time, their initial popularity. Quite interestingly, they didn't stay popular, almost an echo of what we have with Mohammed Morsi and the Egyptian Muslim Brotherhood. Mm-hmm. Maybe you could speak to what you saw then and some of the parallels that you see now.
I think there are some parallels. I think in a sense, I was there at the time, early 90s, when King Hussein was still the monarch there, but the royal family wanted to make a peaceful transition to democracy, and they still do. I think you have actually in Jordan one of the most educated, highly educated populations in the Arab world. They work very hard. They have a lot of professional degrees, a lot of advanced degrees. They're doctors, they're engineers, they're hardworking people, and they wanted to have a greater role of democracy, like the people of Egypt do. So King Hussein, organized and allowed free parliamentary elections, and the first go around, the Muslim Brotherhood was the majority party. After a couple of years of that, they found, well, maybe this isn't quite as hot as we thought it was going to be, because they made a lot of promises and almost prophetic predictions about how much better this was going to be, and Islam was going to take care of you and everything. And suddenly found out that, especially with the Muslim Brotherhood, you have a very extreme element that may be more concerned about tyranny than they are about democracy. I won't go into all the details of that, but let it be said that the Muslim Brotherhood kind of lost the initial favor that they had with the population. Some of that same thing is going on in Egypt now. Another thing, what sparked off the Arab Spring? Was it some sort of Sharia law, desire by the people for that? Or was it they wanted something to eat? Remember that this came at a time when they had trade relations with Russia. The Russian wheat crop failed, and all of a sudden the government was being asked, what are we going to eat this week? And the same thing happened in Jordan when I was there. They had some, fairly minor food riots, but people were in the street because they actually lifted a subsidy that they'd had for bread. Basically they're giving away free bread, which is not as expensive as our welfare system, but there was a scarcity of food in some local places, which they solved eventually. But people are concerned about, where are we going to get food for our families? And I think Egypt was like that last year or 2 years ago. Having the Muslim Brotherhood take over the government didn't necessarily fix that problem. That was an international trade problem, and going into some sort of Islamic fervor, thinking that's going to fix your food problem, is not necessarily true. So I think they're finally saying, I think one of the Fox News observers said, this is one of the few times, if ever in history, where you had 30 million people going to the streets in order to establish a military coup.
I think that's got to be one of the largest grassroots uprisings in recorded history.
Probably so. I mean, this was, and probably successful. You may have seen some of these things in Poland. I mean, basically the people getting together on a grassroots objection to Soviet control. Lech Walesa, the Solidarity movement. This is kind of like a Solidarity movement. The question is, what's going to be next? Are we going to try to double down in Egypt so that now the Muslim Brotherhood has even more control? Or have they had enough of this for now where they want more of a secular, stable, economically based government which will not lie to the people about the great constitutional reforms that they promised? So I think this is actually very exciting to see what's going on over there. Obviously, there's factions that are, the country's kind of in a vacuum. They're maneuvering around for their own local control. But like Jordan, basically when they cross a certain line and become violent, then it becomes the chief of state who will step in this case the army in Egypt, who will say, look, we need a referee to this. We're not getting anywhere with 30 million people in the street. Let's solve the problem and move on.
How awkward is this for our Oval Office? Obviously, we weren't sponsoring the change in Egypt, but once the change was in motion, we certainly didn't get in its way or offer any resistance. We had Mubarak on the payroll for years and years and years and years and dropped him like a hot potato, and all of a sudden sort of warmed up quickly to the Muslim Brotherhood. So, I mean, is it overstatement to say Mr. Morsi was Obama's guy and he just got ousted? How does that reflect on Mr. Obama?
You know, you sometimes talk about counter-cyclical risk. We have counter-cyclical foreign policy. I mean, this is really strange this last year. I mean, I am very, very uncomfortable about selling arms and fighter aircraft to a government that's controlled by the Muslim Brotherhood. These are radical Islamists.
But we're doing the same thing in Syria. I don't think we're selling, we're actually gifting.
Well, back in Egypt, I mean, we were selling them, I think, F-16s here this last year. Why, as long as Morsi was in power, and now he's being ousted, and Senator Leahy apparently just announced, well, now we should cut military aid because the Muslim Brotherhood is not there. This is really, really strange illogic to federal policy. And yet they're trying to hold back here, I guess for political reasons, to say that, well, the president obviously couldn't have been wrong in this, so we're going to have to stay with the party line and say, well, you know, Morsi really was the legitimate government and somehow back him. And I don't know. I mean, I don't think the president's really in a position to announce what they're going to do, because they don't know what they're going to do.
Awkward, to say the least.
Very, very awkward. Very awkward.
Well, so we've talked about different spaces and different territories. One thing that we haven't talked much about is cyberspace. Cyberspace is an area, certainly with Mr. Snowden and some of the released documents, and sort of we had the Julian Assange WikiLeaks issues a few years back. You know, we have both vulnerabilities from a geostrategic standpoint in cyberspace. We also get to do what we're doing right now, which is have a candid conversation about anything we want and have it published internationally. And there is no limitation or control to that. And there's some sense of incredible freedom of the press, which frankly doesn't hardly exist in the mainstream media anymore, given the filtration system and direct political bias, right or left, but a filtration system that doesn't allow for candid conversation. Cyberspace, maybe that's not something that was in the military's purview in 1990. There's only 250,000 people using the internet at that point. Now a third of the world's population is using the internet. Where do you see control? You know, we talked about a little bit earlier federalism and sort of state control on certain issues, and of course the opposite end of that is more centralized control. Do we have this kind of voice 3 years from now, 5 years from now? Or are the threats, quote unquote, in cyberspace sufficient to justify, not actually, but just in practical terms, we'll see legislation in this regard, whether through the fairness doctrine or what have you, limit our ability to explore ideas and understand the world we have and have a candid conversation?
Well, this is definitely one of my interests. Much to my surprise, the Chief Information Office here of the state of Colorado this last year nominated me for a national award for the support of IT structures. I don't know, they had probably 50, 60 applicants. I didn't win, but it was rather interesting that they put my name forward on that because I'm an advocate for reform, better management of our state computer systems. You know, maybe 8 years ago, I don't know in the state of Colorado if you would have found any software system that really worked well. And I think we have made progress in that. But cybersecurity at the state level is becoming a growing area of risk. South Carolina lost a lot of privacy data because of hackers, because they didn't have adequate defenses. Now I'm on sort of advisory committee to our Chief Information Security Officer in Colorado. And we need to take a new look at how the states play in this whole regime. We know that just in the state of Colorado, there are about 600,000 attacks against our computer systems per day. So the state, trying to protect people's health records, trying to protect our own tax records, our state cyber infrastructure, we have a responsibility to protect that data and the computers and the software that we use. We must do this, or else, the public trust is going to be violated. Unfortunately, as we saw like in the Boston massacre, sometimes the information is out there and it's not shared with the state and local governments. We obviously knew there were some bad actors that had a propensity to terrorism, and they were not informed of that. We know that there are a lot of bad actors out there from a number of well-known countries that are attacking not just our corporate infrastructure in the United States, but also our government infrastructure on a daily basis. Sometimes it's for criminal motivations, sometimes it's for political or, as you say, geostrategic motivations. But this is the kind of thing that we cannot continue to put up with. So what's the state going to do? Are we going to become more controlling at the state level of, our data, or even, sort of a balance? I think the NSA concern is that the government is actually using information, maybe violating privacy. But that information doesn't seem to be transparent at all to the state governments. For instance, if we have known threats from international sources that an organization like NSA might know about, they don't share that I know of. They don't share that with the states. Right now, we have no legislators in the state of Colorado with security clearances. So even if we had information at the federal level, they won't share it with us. So even, at the federal level, you have this concept of advice and consent. The federal legislature is supposed to control what NSA does, what the other CIA, other intelligence communities do. In the state, we don't even have access to that information. So how can you make informed public policy without getting a little bit deeper and knowing what's going on?
And is it possible that the state plays the role as sort of buffer? The notion of protecting is legitimate. Then controlling is sort of a cascade and logical next step. In order to protect, we must have some measure of control. But ultimately, the concern is abuse of the information. Again, as you say, there's privacy concerns and whatnot for individual citizens. Could the state offer some sort of a buffer between federal control and abuse of information to how that information can be used?
Well, I think the state should play at least a different role than what we're playing now, because we're seeing the crimes, the attacks are occurring at the state level. And we're not, as far as I know, we're not working with the federal government to put up a comprehensive attack against this. It's kind of like wildfires. Who's responsible for fighting wildfires in Colorado? Okay, some people say it's the federal government, but they're sure not doing it. They've created a gap here, and a lot of our discussion in the legislature is maybe this shouldn't be a federal role at all to manage our forests. Maybe we should manage our forests. Maybe we should fight our own fires. And this is a well-established constitutional principle.
I tell you what, Kent, if anyone from D.C. had driven through our neck of the woods in the last 2 years, they would have seen 90% of the trees in the Pagosa Springs area were already dead because of bark beetles. And it was a tinderbox looking for a match. And that's exactly what we have today. Lightning strike, or whatever the cause may have been, 100,000 acres of pristine national forest. It was not managed. And nobody in Washington, D.C., again, who lives there and doesn't travel here, would know that there's a brewing issue. But I don't know anything about forest management, and I could have told you just driving down the highway. That there, on the hillside, there all around, that's a problem waiting to happen.
Well, I know there's one person in Washington, D.C., that's your Congressman Scott Tipton, because in early 2012, he introduced legislation to return some of this authority back to the states. But this is a well-established principle. It's called the police powers of the state under the 10th Amendment, which says health, life, and safety is the responsibility of the governor of that state. And yet our governors are said, well, you can't declare an emergency until the Department of Agriculture says that you can declare an emergency.
Preposterous.
Yes, it's totally preposterous. This is, people's lives, it's people's property. It's, hundreds of, if not thousands of square miles. We see this in Arizona just recently, where firefighters are dying because of unhealthy forests. So who is responsible for this? I think that's an important thing. And I'm just using that as a side note to come back to the cyber problem. We have similar problems. State and local law enforcement should be enforcing laws. And yet, if we're under attack, do I have a cyber cop from the state government who'll go out and actually, bust somebody's door down, some hacker who is illegally attacking our infrastructure? I don't see that. And I think the most chilling thing is we're living in an environment where we know that our Internal Revenue Service has been politicized. They are taking actions that are political, not for public safety, not for anything else, apparently other than political advantage. Now, is this going off into our intelligence community or not? I think that's a valid question. I mean, I served during a time where, the initials NSA and NRO, just the initials were probably classified. We had tight security on what these intelligence organizations did, but it was very, very clear these are only for foreign intelligence collections. They are not to spy on the American people. Now I don't know what's happening. Are we actually using some of our surveillance assets, because we've done it with the IRS, we've taken political action using government organizations like the IRS, the Department of Justice, and others to spy on Americans. The EPA spies on Americans. So would I believe in this context that the NSA or other foreign intelligence services would not spy on Americans? I find that very chilling.
Well, as we wrap up, I think one of the things that I am hopeful of, and I don't know if I have a good enough reason to be hopeful in this regard, but I'm hopeful that there will be a paradigm shift away from centralized control of everything and a return to sort of state responsibility and a grassroots management of government, of the people, by the people, for the people. That paradigm shift would include the kinds of things that you've suggested, going full circle to the legislation dealing with sound money. And to see that begin to emerge, you put things in place, and perhaps it's not the right time, but the right time may be approaching, where enough people say this is preposterous. No one's aware of the forest in my area. No one's aware of the social needs in my area. No one's aware of the monetary and economic needs in my area. No one's aware of the security needs in my area. And where it begins to be common sense that those things should be dealt with on a state-by-state basis, and not at the federal level. So I guess, again, I'm hopeful maybe that's a dream, but having legislation that has already been proposed, worked its way through, can be resurrected and employed in the future. All you're needing is a different general sentiment, and circumstances may provide that over the next few years.
Mm-hmm. Well, I found I'm actually sort of co-teaching a class at University of Colorado Springs tomorrow evening, and it's on the politics of the law. And the instructor is starting his class with Plato's allegory of the cave. If your readers haven't heard that, you can find it online very easily. One of the classic ideas was if you took a set of people and put them in a cave and had them facing a blank wall for their entire lives, so all they would ever see was the shadows of the light coming into the mouth of that cave. And they would have to extrapolate, what is it that's walking outside the cave? But they can never look. They could always have to look at that blank wall. Well, according to Plato, it was the job of the philosopher to go outside the cave, take a look at what really was out there, and then come back and tell the sort of partially blind people what was going on outside their cave. What about this? What if the philosophers are the ones inside the cave? And they cannot see the reality of what's going on outside. What if the economists are in there looking at a blank wall called Keynesianism, and they're not seeing the reality of those Egyptians on the street that don't have anything to eat?
Connecting the dots between our monetary policy here in the U.S., dollarized countries all over the world, and inflation that we continue to export.
Right. And if you're using the wrong model, or if that philosophy of government is not real, and I mean, I don't know many philosophers that agree with each other. So which one's right? You know, maybe it's the philosophers that are inside the cave that are only seeing the shadows. They're not seeing the reality of what's going on. And I think, Mr. Limbaugh talks about low information voters, and I think that's probably an important thing to remember in Egypt. You don't have a lot of it, you have masses of people, some of them don't have a lot of education. In the United States, we certainly have the opportunity for that. And we should be trusting our people who are creative with their own money. It gets back to Ronald Reagan's philosophy. Who will give the most value? A government bureaucrat trying to fight forest fires in Washington, D.C., or somebody who actually lives in Durango who can see the trees burning? And I think this is where, as you said, federalism in our American system is not just a controlled mechanism from downtown Washington, D.C. It's a mixture of local government, state government, and federal government, and we've lost that. We need to go back and take a look at that.
Well, Ken, thanks for joining us today. It's a unique opportunity for us to weave politics as it's being done in real time with our commentary. I'm glad you've been listening to the commentary for a few years now and are joining us on the other side to contribute. Great to have you with us.
Well, greatly my pleasure. Thank you very much, Ed.
Well, you've been listening to the McAlvany Weekly Commentary. I'm Kevin Orrick along with David McAlvany. You can find us at McAlvany.com. That's McAlvany.com. Or give us a call at 800-525-9556.
This has been the McAlvany Weekly Commentary. The views expressed should not be considered to be a solicitation or a recommendation for your investment portfolio. You should consult a professional financial advisor to assess your suitability for risk and investment. Join us again next week for a new edition of the McAlvany Weekly Commentary.